first speaker will be Andrea Perrella, who's an associate professor of political science at Wilfrid Laurier University. And that's all I'm going to say. Andrea is very experienced in local municipal politics. I hear him with Mike Farwell on the radio often. And so I'm very glad to have him along with everyone else here. So Andrea, I'm going to turn it over to you to start, and then I'll introduce the next speaker after you're finished.
Well, thank you very much. And just to start off, my comment about quality of candidates is in general, I qualified it. I said, not to insult anybody who's been recently elected, because we did elect some really good people to council this year, and there are good people who are being elected. But overall, low turnout does tend to produce a lower quality of candidates. But that's not really what I want to talk about. I was asked to maybe diagnose a little bit about what's happening with turnout as a whole. Is there any underlying cause that we can draw attention to? And what I'd like to show you now is I'd like to show you, well, I'd like to discuss voter turnout, not too much in technical terms, but I want to look at it in historical terms as well. Maybe consider some generational change, and also take into account campaign dynamics. So in history, we've seen that there were times when turnout was higher, and then it seems to have gone through a slide. So that's some historical break. But within any of those periods, there are, of course, election by election changes. So there are factors that are more short-term and more related to a particular campaign that may explain why turnout is on the decline. So I'm less interested in why turnout was down for a particular election. I'm more concerned about overall. And I'd like to show you this graph, and it may be a little bit messy, but we'll clarify it. So this is overall voter turnout in many places. So the red line is in the Canadian federal elections. The yellow-orange line is Ontario provincial elections. The blue line up on top here is Quebec provincial elections. I also included a green line here for Yukon, the United Kingdom, as well as in the bottom here, usually at the bottom, is a black line for American presidential elections. So it's a bit messy. It looks like a scrambled or a very bad weave, but they're all kind of tending in the same direction. They all seem to be, pointing down. And particularly, if there is any epoch, then it's something happened around the 1990s that led to a decline. And you see that in the UK, you see that in the United States, in Ontario, federally. So there's something happening in the late 80s, early 90s that turned off a lot of voters. And again, not just municipally, pretty much everywhere. Now, again, this is a bit of a messy graph, so let's maybe focus on Canada and Ontario. And what I'm looking for is some general, big picture, potential explanation as to what is happening. Consistently, turnout is lower in Ontario provincial elections than it is in national federal elections. That's interesting to note. Let's add Quebec. Quebec consistently, in Quebec provincial elections, their turnout is generally higher than it is in federal elections overall. So Quebecers vote more in provincial elections than Canadians vote in Canadian elections, and Ontarians vote in Ontario elections. So already we're starting to see some major gaps here that require some kind of an explanation. And we can add the Yukon, and Yukon is interesting because at the beginning it was kind of low. Then they introduced the party system, and turnout has been high, and I would say consistently healthy. Why? What is it that Yukon is doing right that the rest of us are not doing well? I can go on to other places as well, but I also want to look at referendum results. General election campaigns come and go, and they could just be considered normal. A referendum is special, and sometimes it engages more people than a single issue may engage voters more than a campaign, which may involve and implicate a variety of issues. And let's take a look at the turnout at some notable elections. The 1995 Quebec referendum. I remember I was there, and turnout was probably highest in any kind of turnout ever in Canada. And I remember people were in their wheelchairs going to vote. So if you had a pulse, you made an effort to go vote. Why? In 1992, there was a referendum also in Canada and in Quebec on the Charlottetown constitutional reforms. Turnout was still fairly high in Quebec, higher than normal in rest of Canada, but not overly, not outstanding. In Ontario in 2007, we had a referendum along with a general campaign on the electoral system change. And turnout was terrible. In Waterloo, we had a referendum on water fluoridation. Turnout, now it seems good, but at the time, it was considered rather weak. So we have the phenomena here that even a referendum which focuses on a single issue may not necessarily engage the public. What is it that about the Quebec referendum in '95 that is different than the Waterloo fluoridation referendum in 2010? I'm also looking at other factors, and I collected data from the last federal election at the constituency level. So I collected all 338 ridings data on turnout, and I also look at the makeup of those ridings. What was their labor force like? Particularly focusing on labor force participation, which is different than unemployment. Unemployment rate is based on those who are in the labor force. Labor force participation includes those who have a job and those who are looking. And I look at that because when labor force participation declines, it means more and more people are giving up looking for work. It's an indicator of economic health. I also look at the general age of the population in each riding. As we know, older people vote more. And I also look at the overall urban-rural mix of a constituency. And sometimes it's not so easy to tell. I mean, we know when we're driving through a rural area, we know when we're driving through a city, but some constituencies have a little bit of both. And even a riding locally like Kitchener-Conestoga seems, on a map, it seems predominantly rural, but a lot of the voters are in Kitchener. So there is a need to look at what I call the urbanness or the ruralness of a riding, because anecdotally what I find is turnout is higher in rural areas, and it could be because in a rural area there's a greater community spirit, and in urban area there's more anonymity. And the results that I found is that indeed, and I wouldn't look at the percentages too much. This is overall trends that as a riding gets older and older, or the average age, turnout increases. As the labor force participation is healthier, turnout increases. Unemployment has a more modest effect. So as the unemployment rate gets higher, turnout is lower. And I found the ruralness variable a little less convincing, but yeah, the more rural a constituency, the more turnout. But there are other factors, and I even have a top 5 of each. So the top 5 turnout in the last federal election is in some are mainly rural areas, but what's remarkable is the generally high level of labor force participation. And in the bottom 5, the labor force participation is weaker. So that leads me to wonder whether there is something to be said about the overall, and something I mentioned today on the radio interview with 570 News, a certain social contract. There was a time when we believed that as long as we work hard in any job, we'd be able to afford a house, buy a car, go on vacation. And that promise is gone. And now people work hard. They even are highly educated and work hard. But a lot of the conditions have changed, and it's much more difficult to buy a house, buy a car, and go on vacation. And not because of the recent rise in inflation. This is a phenomenon that's been happening, I would say, for several decades, particularly in the 1990s, but I would argue that it started in the 1960s when there were increased challenges to the welfare system, increased challenges and to unionized workers, unionized labor, and also increased pressures for organizations and businesses to relocate where it's cheaper to operate. So there's been structural economic changes, as well as generational change. The older generations that had a sense of duty to vote and perhaps a sense of patriotism to their nation are being replaced by those who do not have replaced by younger generations who do not have that similar set of values. And a lot of it has to do with these older generations being raised during the Depression, during the Second World War, when there was a need to come together. So there wasn't that urgency that the newer generations have experienced. And certainly parties and other organizations can mobilize voters. And I would add to that, in the case of municipal elections, candidates. It is important to knock on doors. It is important to engage with citizens. And so a lot of these factors seem to be more structural, however, in terms of the lack of the damage to the social contract. Also, this idea of an election being seen as important. Remember, Quebecers vote more in their elections. People in Yukon vote more. Why? Well, they see their election as more of an expression of their identity, or they see that level of government as increasingly important. And the Yukon and the territories have become more important to their citizens. So they're not just administrative units. And maybe municipalities are seen as administrative units, less as a community. So municipal elections may not trigger any kind of identity among citizens. That's not always the case, but maybe there should be a need for greater civic pride, being proud of being a citizen of the region of Waterloo, so that when you vote, you're not just voting for this candidate or that candidate or on a list of issues. You're voting because you like belonging here. So that is a factor that I think needs to be taken into account. There's this idea of meaning. What does an election mean? I think for some voters, we see that a particular election has greater meaning for them. And so they're more prepared to participate. So again, participation involves a lot of things. I'm not too sure how many of them we can easily address and fix for the next time around, because a lot of these problems have been percolating for decades. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those comments. When we had talked, we had asked that you would provide sort of that background information. I think you did an excellent job of doing that. It's kind of interesting. You'd think municipal politics, because you're focused on your city, your community, that there would be more of an identity connection for people, because, we say, oh, politics is local, and you can't get much more local and pertinent to your everyday life. Maybe it's a matter of helping people better understand how important and relevant municipal politics is from when they get up in the morning to when they go to bed at night.